Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Planet Ready podcast. This podcast is brought to you by Spin Global, a public benefit corporation that exists to disrupt disasters from neighborhoods to nations. And don't forget to check out PlanetReady.com, the world's premier online disaster risk reduction and emergency preparedness platform for individuals, families, houses of worship, businesses, and governments. And remember, Planet Ready brings preparedness where people are. Our guests today on the podcast are Camila Tapias and Peter Williams, members of the Arise Network. Let's listen to their stories and learn about what they took from their experiences. Let's hear from Camila Tapias.
One of the disasters that has had an impact in my life and the way I approach my work is Hurricane Iota in 2020. I am originally from Colombia, and in November, this disaster impacted one of the most beautiful Caribbean islands in Colombia, San Andres and Providencia. Something that was absolutely devastating is that 98% of Providencia's infrastructure was destroyed. One of the things that impacted me the most was the slow government response, the false promises from the administration, and the lack of preparedness in this area. The president of Colombia had a plan to rebuild the island in 100 days. This plan was designed so that most of the island's infrastructure could be in good conditions for all the inhabitants and to be better prepared for the upcoming hurricane season. However, this plan failed. As of June of this year, 2021, they had only built 2 houses. The storm couldn't come at a worse time for this island's economy, which is heavily dependent on tourism and artisanal fishing. This situation has made me question the way developing countries could be better prepared, to emphasize the need for private sector collaboration to develop real investments in vulnerable communities like San Andres and Providencia, and to hold the government accountable. This was another instance where I confirmed that as a society, we are too reactive, and that shouldn't be the way forward. The magnitude of this disaster, and also the way it was handled, has motivated me even more to continue finding solutions to develop public-private partnerships and different ways to support these communities, but also in my future work as I continue looking for ways to support my home country, but also other countries around the world to be better prepared for disasters of any kind. That's one of the reasons why the work we're doing with Arise is so critical, and we need to continue building on this moment to see real progress.
Now let's hear from Peter Williams.
In my very last job before I retired from IBM, I worked as part of a joint IBM Bechtel team assisting in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. We were asked to go help the Puerto Rico Education Department figure out how to kind of get back on their feet and how to make themselves more resilient so that they did a better job of withstanding the next hurricane that hits that island. Working jointly with a group of engineers and with a group of my own colleagues was actually a pretty insightful experience. When we were there, we were driving over power lines that were still lying in the road, and you're hoping that they're not live as you're driving over them. There were plenty of buildings with the roofs torn off. There were trees down all over the place. There were entire forests that have been stripped bare of leaves by the power of the wind, and it was really quite an instructive experience. So we went out to a couple of towns in the mountainous center of Puerto Rico, very windy roads, often quite difficult to drive on with all of the sort of downed trees and whatnot. And we were talking to the teachers at the elementary and secondary schools in those towns. And one of the things that came out was just how much the school itself and the teachers had been able to do to try to help pull the community together after the hurricane. The school became the kind of central point, the distribution center for such relief supplies as there were, the exchange point for information. Hey, does anybody know about X? Does anybody know about Y? And it just brought home to me, you kind of understood it intellectually, but it really brought it home kind of viscerally, just how much disaster resilience is both a bottom up as well as the top down kind of activity. So you got the top down government, do this, go here, do that. And you've got the bottom up people figuring it out, because there's no way a government can ever do it all for themselves. I mean, arguably the government of Puerto Rico could have done a much better job than it did. But even so, there's always going to be an element that is based on self-reliance and people doing their own thing. And a lot of our thought was put into, well, how can we create a manual for these teachers so that, next time they've got a bit of a playbook to follow, rather than having them just kind of make it up, which is effectively what they were doing. They did a fantastic job, but if we could help them figure out better how to play that role next time, that seemed to be a considerable service. Well, I still work in disaster resilience, and it's just underlined to me that I have to sort of think about how do you help towns and cities and countries stimulate the bottom up as well as the top down. You've got to have the right governance at the top of the tree. You've got to have the right people in the room. But then it's about enabling the community, enabling key figures in the community. Churches in some places might fulfill the same role as, education departments. How do you help those organizations fulfill that kind of bottom up, community driven role? And it's made a big difference to how I approach the whole job of helping towns and cities become more resilient.
Now it's time for some Q&A to get some additional preparedness insight. So this week on the Planet Ready podcast, we'll be talking about the UN Disaster Risk Reduction ARISE Coalition, which stands for the Private Sector Alliance for Disaster Resilient Societies. ARISE was started by UNDRR in 2015 to support the private sector to become a key partner in reducing disaster risk. It's grown to over 350 members and has over 20 networks across the world. There's incredible energy and appetite to grow ARISE and to equip it to affect change in how the private sector invests in a risk-informed, sustainable future. Well, let's go ahead and introduce our guests today to talk about ARISE. Joining us on the podcast is Camila Tapias, my fellow colleague and a global disaster resilience specialist at Spin Global, and ARISE U.S. board member as well. Camilla worked as a presidential fellow in the Office of the President at George Washington University while pursuing her master's degree in public administration. She acted as a point of contact for student outreach, communication, and safety while leading efforts to update the school's closed point of dispensing plan during the pandemic. Before that, she played D1 for the GW women's basketball team. Buckets. At Spin Global, Camilla supports local government, private industry, higher education, and international clients through research, training, stakeholder, and engagement support. In addition, we also have Peter Williams, the chair of the ARISE US network and lead author of the UN City Disaster Resilience Scorecard, now used by over 330 cities globally. Peter's a regular judge on the California Clean Tech Open and Imagine H2O, both competitions designed to help select startups for funding. He's an IBM Distinguished Engineer, having retired in 2018, and was formerly Executive Council member of NOAA's National Integrated Drought Information System, as well as a visiting lecturer on smarter cities and communities at Stanford University. He also has 5 U.S. patent awards for his work. We're glad to have both of you on the podcast today. How are you doing today, Camilla?
I'm doing well. Thank you, Alwin. Very glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. And how are you doing today, Peter?
Yeah, likewise, doing well and very glad to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Awesome. Great to have both of you on. Well, let's go ahead and dive into the discussion today. So Camilla, let's go ahead and hit you with the first question. So would you mind telling us a little bit about the ARISE network and why you decided to get involved?
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, the Alliance of Private Sector and with ARISE having so many networks and, working with the same purpose to reduce risk. And just, I think for me, was very appealing at the beginning, understanding that I was going to be working with leaders in the community, leaders in their fields to solve real issues. And something that I really like about ARISE, and definitely not just in the US network, but just understanding just the global network, how there's a lot of versatility and a lot of, very big companies, private sector entities, some that are smaller, but everyone has a lot of creativity, innovation, the use of technology, and just really having that opportunity to drive innovation, within the private sector, and just understanding that there has to be this whole community engagement and approach to addressing risk and reducing risk. So that was definitely one of the
the main reasons why I was very not only inspired and motivated to be a part of the board and this network.
Great, great. And how would you respond to the question, Peter?
So, working for IBM, they always had a huge kind of tradition of public-private partnerships. So it was something that was very familiar. They were interested in disaster resilience as an area to expend time and some of their corporate social responsibility activities. I became involved with that, and that's how I first came into contact with Arise. But the single aha moment actually came in a conversation with the US Navy in the context of their facilities down in Newport News and the Tidewater region, where they had clearly realized that, look, we can spend millions or billions of dollars hardening all our facilities and making them more flood proof and less exposed to high tides and hurricanes and all that kind of thing. But unless we invest in helping our workforce get to work the day after a hurricane, we're just as hosed as if we'd never bothered spending $1 in the first place. So there was the realization there that basically they have to work with their community if they want to continue to operate those facilities. It's not enough just to sort of pull up the drawbridge and physically harden your facility. And that's true of any other company as well. I regularly come across companies that say, we've done this, this, and this, but you're going to have a workforce the day after a disaster, and they're sort of left doing a goldfish impression because it's something they hadn't really thought of. And that was the single aha moment that disaster resilience is, it has to be a public-private activity, or it's nothing. Government can't do it all on its own. The private sector can't do it all on its own. They have to, in the saying, they hang together or they hang separately.
Exactly. Well, let's go ahead and stay on you, Peter. I want to ask you this next question. Can you tell us a little bit about some of your experience working with the Arise organization and how it shaped the lens through which you view climate change and disaster risk reduction as well?
Sure. So the climate change, disaster risk reduction question first, there's a huge interplay between them. You can think of chronic stresses like climate change or deforestation or chronic environmental stress or chronic social stress. And you can think about disasters as acute events. The point being that the chronic stresses can either make your disaster more likely. And an example of that would be, let's say that you build on the sand dunes that were preventing your town from being flooded by a hurricane storm surge. And all of a sudden you've lost the buffering capability of the sand dunes. That's an example of chronic environmental stress predisposing you to a disaster. Conversely, if you've had a disaster and you've got economic and social stress, that can hinder your ability to recover. And you think, for example, of Haiti as an example, and maybe to a lesser degree, New Orleans as well. Their recoveries were both longer and harder, and indeed are still not complete, but longer and harder than they ever needed to be, simply because of the social and economic stress that existed there in the first place. So you've got that huge interplay, and it's the same with climate change. Climate change brings a whole new family of disasters to cities that had previously never had to worry about it. But equally, it can, in some cases, hinder the ability of the city to actually recover and restore its economic activity and restore its vitality and so forth in the aftermath of a disaster. So you've got that big interplay going on. One of the best places I saw that actually started to realize that was I was using the city disaster resilience scorecard with a place called Puerto Montt in Chile. And Chile is actually, they seem to be incredibly together with their disaster resilience. They've had a lot of natural disasters in their time. They're extremely earthquake prone. They're extremely prone to volcanism and so on. And there was a very clear understanding that that the public and private sectors had to work together if anything was going to be achieved. A very clear understanding that you're not going to achieve resilience in defiance of nature. You've got to work with nature to actually achieve that. And I think it was one of the most salutary experiences because, naively you might think, well, a European or a US country would be, or a European or North American country would be further ahead in that respect, but not necessarily so, actually. The depth of understanding that I found in Chile was equal to anything I've seen anywhere. As you can probably tell from my accent, I'm a European. But what I saw in Chile in terms of the understanding was probably the most advanced that I've seen. And it was very impressive.
Interesting. I've never looked at it that way. Well, Camilla, how would you also respond to the question?
Yeah, no, I definitely think that as I've not only been part of Arise and understanding that, every country and each network, even though we're all working to, reinforce the Sendai framework with UNDR, everyone, as Peter just mentioned, with Chile and just other places, just for me, the use and the need for innovation has been very, very important, as like what I've noticed, not only to address some of this risk and just in terms of this collaboration that we've seen, and not only just in terms of the climate change and natural hazards, but also man-made, right? A lot of what we've seen arise with cybersecurity, all these things that even with through COVID, and just the importance of understanding that engaging, the private sector to address some of these issues is key. And and I think that for me also just to learn in terms of best practices, which is one of the things that I really appreciate, and I am very excited. And that's why I think Arise is such a great opportunity for people and for countries to learn about some of the things that they're doing that have worked, that are not working necessarily, and also for us as board members, some of the things that we want to do, to learn from other networks and understand how can we all better collaborate at the end of the day to just meet um, the same goal and just reduce risk and help just more in terms of awareness for communities that may not be as involved in this process for decision making and et cetera. So I think just really understanding the big picture, that a lot of people sometimes may think that, with climate change or just disasters is the main or the first response is mainly just natural disasters, right? Or things that it just or very, very siloed approaches to tackling some of these issues. So that's why I think that just the little things that we're saying that we're doing, and even now, with Planet Ready, which of course is something that we've emphasized before in terms of the innovation and a platform to just make sure that we reach the 99% and talk and engage with more communities around the world. It's something that I definitely see more places trying to figure out ways to collaborate when there's disruption to critical infrastructure and community lifelines and just a bunch of supply chains and that we've continued to see and is definitely rising. So.
Exactly. Well, Camilla, I want to stay with you and ask this other additional question. So, what exactly it is that you personally hope to accomplish while working on the board of Arise?
So going back to some of the things I mentioned in terms of understanding best practices, from other networks, I think some of the things that we've talked about that I'm also very excited about is this collaboration with other networks, right? It's understanding we're already trying to start this process, but I think that even though we're the U.S. network, that doesn't mean that just in terms of collaboration on experiences, going back to kind of the point that I was mentioning before, we can't get things done necessarily. You just focus on us. So I think that understanding that for me, also having the opportunity, to speak another language in terms of, for example, we talk about in South America, and even what Peter mentioned, even we're talking to the Rise Mexico network, they're doing really well, and I think that is something that is very important, not only for me, but I know that for the board, and just in terms of just engaging our membership. Sometimes I feel like people think that increasing our network and engaging is only external, but I definitely want to make sure that internally we get to know our members, we really understand their needs, and then in that way we're able to collaborate in a better way. Definitely we want to make sure that our network grows. That's going to help the global network as well. And one of my roles is at the board is in terms of our communications, right? So increasing our social media presence, making sure that more people are aware and really use us as a tool, and then come to us and understand, okay, we want to learn about more the private sector engagement and what are things going on with the UN, right? UNDRR events that we can participate in. So I think that's something that we're really trying to do, that I'm really trying to make sure that our social media presence is definitely stronger. And we recently created, a Twitter account. We also have LinkedIn, where people can definitely join, and happy to definitely share some of that later on. And yeah, so that's definitely some of like the bigger picture that I'm saying. And as is relatively new as we're starting on the board, definitely still learning, engaging, talking to people, and trying to just make sure that they join. That's what we want.
Great, great. And what about you, Peter? What do you personally hope to accomplish?
Very much echo what Camilla said, but with a slightly different perspective. Arise US spent the last couple of years really establishing its groundwork, so to say, putting in place all of the procedures and the infrastructure that are needed to build a flourishing organization. Well, now we've got that groundwork. I have the happy job of being able to say, okay, where can we take it? How do we now build from here? How do we leverage the groundwork that we've done? And the idea is to leverage it in two directions. One is to build the strength of the network, so there's a true value to being in it, so that people can find things out, they can access resources, they can tap into experience, and likewise they can offer their resources and their experience through that network as well. And the other is we do practical stuff on the ground, projects that actually make a difference to people, that actually make a difference to towns and cities, actually make a difference to lives and livelihoods across the US, and ideally beyond that as well. We've got a number of projects that we're kicking off. We want to build a dialogue with the insurance industry and figure out ways that they can become better involved. We're creating a tool to enable critical asset management, more effective critical asset management by towns and cities, which is an issue a lot of them have. We are looking at creating a service that facilitates towns and cities as they come together for the first time to think about resilience. So we've got a number of ideas that we want to pursue, and those are and those are some examples of them.
Great, great. All right. And staying on you, Peter, for this final question. So, are there any particular experiences or moments that have stood out for you thus far while working with the organization?
Yeah, the very first scorecard workshop we ever did, we were in, I won't mention the name of the town out of fairness to them. It was a US town. And they were recovering from Superstorm Sandy. And we did this workshop, and it was organized by the local business organization, in fact. And there was a conversation was going on between the director of planning, who was explaining to the room what the development plans were for the town and the sorts of things that the town would need to be thinking about in the future. And in the audience was the director of emergency management. And the planner said, yeah, we've got this, we're planning on what he called this transit-oriented development in the middle of town, meaning higher density development where people are kind of discouraged from having their own cars because of the availability of public transportation. And he was saying, yeah, we're going to have about another 9,000 people there, we hope eventually, and so on and so on. And the director of emergency management was hearing this, and his eyebrows shot up. And he said, so let me get this straight. There's going to be another 9,000 people in town who I might have to evacuate because they don't have their own cars. And nobody told him. And I thought, I say this was the first scorecard workshop we ever did. And I thought, well, that right there, this thing's earned its keep. It's just added value to justify creating it right there. But here's the thing, resilience is a team sport. And that's what that brought home to me. It's a team sport. And it's a team sport within government, it's a team sport between government agencies, and it's a team sport between the public sector and the private sector, as we were discussing. And I guarantee you, every city in the world and probably every company in the world has its own version of that conversation that needs to happen, but hasn't yet. Or you've got assumptions that aren't consistent one with another. So you might have the energy company planning on the basis of one set of disaster scenarios and the city government or the water company planning on a different set. Well, they're all going to be faced with the same disaster. And if they've all got different assumptions, it's all going to fall apart. So how do you create what in IBM used to be called one version of the truth? In other words, everybody's subscribing to the same version of the truth based on a shared understanding of how each other is going to react. So that, for me, was an experience that really stood out and triggered a whole kind of chain of thought, really, about how cities need to go about doing this. Just one final example, I was doing another workshop with a water utility in Florida. And these water utilities, a lot of them share similar infrastructure. Turned out they all had different assumptions about the impact of sea level rise over the coming 25 years. Yeah, they share the same infrastructure. So it was like there were going to be steps in the Atlantic Ocean as you went from one water utility to the next water utility, because they all had a different view of what might happen. one thing that came out of that workshop was, well, you guys want to get together and agree some common assumptions, surely to go. And I went, yeah, I guess you're right. So again, they needed one version of the truth. They needed to get to one version of the truth. That only happens with conversation. Those conversations don't happen unless you specifically make the effort to make them happen. And that's the importance of it.
Exactly. Having conversations to get to the truth. All right, let's go to you, Camilla. How do you feel about the question?
So I definitely will take a completely different approach. I don't have a specific example as Peter mentioned with his experience. I think I'm going to take it more on a positive side in terms of with Arise and just the few months that I've been a part of Arise and the board and seeing the potential that it has. I think I've been very overwhelmed and excited about just the excitement from members that they have to make sure that the board the network grows, right? And then they're really understanding, I think really a little connected to what Peter said, the importance of having these conversations and taking a more of a proactive approach and their respective roles with their communities, whatever they're doing, and I think really understanding that you need this kind of collaboration to make sure that we're more resilient in the communities that we're serving. And down the line, I think some of the things that the UN and UNDRR, they use is how can we build back better? And I think that's something that we're definitely trying to do. And so I think that some of the things that, although it's relatively recent in terms of what we're trying to do, and we're trying to make sure that we get going and there's a lot of potential. I think I'm very encouraged. I'm very optimistic to see all the potential that we have. And I think that's why understanding that all the people that we're connecting, and again, we're including also educational institutions that they're also working, to reduce risk. And it's understanding that there's a lot of people that I didn't know about, a lot of organizations that were just also learning more about their mission and what they're trying to do to help. And I think with some of the recent examples that we've seen, even, not going too far with COVID, right? And that people are talking more about this, the importance of preparedness, right? And risk reduction and not being so reactive to when something happens, and then how can we reduce and the impact of disasters, either if they're natural or man-made. So definitely encouraged by the network and some of the collaboration and future potential that we have, not only with the global board and other networks as well, but definitely always tying it back to what Peter said. I think it's great, and that's exactly what you see from our chair with the US network, some of the great work that he's doing, that he's leading at, that he sees firsthand in terms of this groundwork that we're really trying to just walk the talk based on our mission and what we're trying to accomplish with UNDRR and just the network. So
great. Awesome to get your thoughts on some of these questions, both of you. And now it's time for us to transition into the next segment of the Planet Ready podcast. It's called the Planet Ready Up segment. And in this segment, we're going to be doing a game show where we're putting our guests in the hot seat. That would be both of you. So today we're going to be playing the game Name That Decade, where we're going to be asking both of you some questions regarding famous private-public partnerships that took place in the past. You both ready to play?
Yep.
Let's do it.
Don't worry. If there's any confusion, I'll just give you some options. There's some options out there just in case. All right. Who wants the first question? Camilla, let's start with you.
Sure. All right. Well, thank you.
All right. Awesome. So here's your first question. So much of the early infrastructure of the United States was built by what can be considered public-private partnerships. This includes the Philadelphia and Lancaster Turnpike Road in Pennsylvania. Which was initiated in what century?
This has to be a while back. I'm gonna say either 17th or 18th century. I'm gonna go with 18th century.
18th
I'll
century.
go with the 17th then, just because.
Okay, we're I think we may be close to one of us.
Okay. Those are final answers. You're locking those answers in. All right. The correct answer is the 1700s. All right.
For the 18th century. Yeah. Okay. Yep.
Okay. All right. Here's the next question for both of you. All right. Although PPPs are an ancient phenomenon, they were not studied seriously by scholars until which decade in the 20th century?
I have to go to Peter first.
Yeah, I'd say the 1960s.
1960s. All right. What about you, Camilla?
So when it started to become more like serious, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, sure. So although private-public partnerships are an ancient phenomenon, they weren't studied seriously by scholars until which decade in the 20th century?
So it's 20th. I'm gonna go with the 80s.
Going with the 80s? All
Yeah.
right. And you're going with, that was the 60s, was it, Peter?
Yep.
Both locking in those answers?
Yep.
All right. The correct answer is the 1980s.
Oh, there you go.
Oh, damn. I'm on a roll now.
Camilla's coming up.
Keep it going.
All right. Awesome. Okay. You both are doing a good job. All right. Here's the next question. In the 1990s, the Maryvale Mall in Phoenix, Arizona became what through a private-public partnership?
I have no idea. A public market?
It's a pretty good guess. How do you feel, Camilla?
So I actually travel to Arizona a lot, so I don't want to say I'm necessarily cheating, but I think based on it's a mall, so that has to be something big. And yes, a lot of land over there. So I'm gonna say that it has to be what's a mall? Either store, probably a school. Is it like a school or like I don't want to say a prison. No, let's go with a school.
You locking in those answers? Answers locked in?
Yep.
All right. The correct answer is 2 high schools. All right.
Oh,
okay.
2 high schools.
Here you go, Camilla. Pretty close. Pretty close.
Oh, wow. All right.
All right.
Okay, well, I said 1. Half a point.
Half a point. We'll give you the full point just for the heck of it. All right, last question. In 2020, the National Institute of Health brought partners like Johnson & Johnson, Novartis, Pfizer, and Bristol Myers Squibb to accomplish what?
Create a COVID vaccine.
Yep, I second that one.
All right. Well, shoot, you guys knew that one right off the bat. That's the correct answer. The Coronavirus Treatment Acceleration Program. Awesome job. Awesome job to both of you. Great job. This is like the first, the Planet Ready Up segment we had where like you guys were just knocking them out of the ballpark. You guys are just killing them out here. Awesome job. Awesome job. Well, hey, I love playing this game with you. I really appreciate having both of you on the podcast as well. This was extremely great. I'm sure our viewers learned a lot. I know I definitely learned a lot. Happy to have had both of you on. This was awesome. Thank you so much for coming. And that's it for this episode, everyone. We want to go ahead and give a special thanks once again to our guests, Camilla Tapias and Peter Williams, for being on the episode today. If you want to find out more about Camilla's work, you can visit spinglobal.org, or you can visit our YouTube channel at Planet Ready by Spin Global. And if you'd like to find out more about Peter Williams, you can also visit the Arise Global Network.org. I also want to give a special thanks to our audience for tuning in today, because these episodes would not be possible without any of you. We want to thank you all so much for tuning in, and we can't wait for you to join us in our next episode of the Planet Ready podcast. But in the meantime, we hope you all get ready for it. You've been listening to the Planet Ready podcast, proudly brought to you by Spin Global, a public benefit corporation that exists to disrupt disasters from neighborhoods to nations. Do you have questions or a topic you'd like us to explore? You can reach us at podcast@spinglobal.org. Make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel at Planet Ready by Spin Global. Don't forget to visit planetready.com and prepare yourself and your community on the world's premier online disaster risk reduction and emergency preparedness platform.